There's a version of you that never showed up. Not because you didn't want it to, not because you weren't good enough. Something somewhere along the way quietly held it back. Think about the last time you had an idea that excited you, a business, a hard conversation you needed to have, a different kind of life. For a moment it felt possible, and then, without you really noticing when, it didn't. You didn't decide to give up on it. Nobody told you no, it just faded. You told yourself it wasn't the right time. Here's the strange part. If you ask people why they didn't do the thing they wanted to do, they usually give you a simple answer. Money, timing, responsibilities. And that answer isn't a lie. But it's rarely the whole truth either. Underneath it, there's usually a quieter reason. One most people never say out loud, sometimes because they've never even looked at it. Picture a ship, not moving, sitting still in open water, sails up, wind blowing the right direction, and it doesn't move. From the shore it looks broken. You'd guess the engine failed or the sails are torn. But none of that is true. The ship is fine, the wind is fine. The problem is under the water. There's an anchor down there dropped, so long ago that most of the crew forgot it was ever lowered. You can't see it from above. You can only see what it does. A ship that should be moving and isn't. This is closer to how most people live than they'd like to admit. We like to think our lives are shaped by what happens to us, the job we got or didn't get, the people we met, the luck we had or didn't have. And some of that is real, but talk to enough people, and you'll notice something odd. Two people can have almost the same life, the same chances, and one moves forward, while the other stays still for years. Same wind, same water, different outcome. The difference usually isn't visible from the outside, it's underneath. It's the anchor nobody sees. Psychologists have a name for part of this. They call it self-limiting behavior. And here's the strange part. Most of the time you're not even aware you're doing it. That's what makes it so powerful. A problem you can see, you fight. A problem you can't see, you just accept as the way things are. Think about how strange that is. If someone physically stopped you from going after your goals, you'd push back. You'd fight it. But when the thing stopping you is inside your own head, you don't fight it. You agree with it. You call it being realistic. That's worth sitting with for a second. The anchor doesn't feel like an anchor. It feels like wisdom. It feels like caution. It feels like you, simply seeing things clearly. This documentary is about 11 of these anchors. Fear that looks like caution. Comfort that looks like peace. The opinions of people who will forget what they said about you in a week. Old ideas about yourself you never updated. Mistakes you never stopped paying for. A hunger for quick relief that quietly replaces the hunger for a real life. The habit of measuring your life against someone else's. The belief that starting is only worth it if the ending is guaranteed. Relationships that drain you slowly, so slowly you don't notice. Days that pass without a reason, because no one ever asked you what yours was. A need to be right that costs more than being wrong ever would. And the quiet lie that you have more time than you actually do. None of these show up loudly, none of them come with a warning. That's exactly why they work so well. Here's something worth noticing about anchors. They're not built to sink a ship. That's not their job. Their job is to keep it still, safe in a way, unmoving in a way that can look from far away like stability. Maybe that's the real reason these things are so hard to fight. They're not trying to ruin your life. They're trying to protect it. Fear protects you from failing. Comfort protects you from struggle. Other people's opinions protect you from being rejected. Every anchor on this list once had a purpose. It's just that the purpose ran out a long time ago, and nobody told it to let go. Here's a simple question. If you took away every real excuse in your life right now, and were only left with what's actually possible for you today, would you be doing what you're doing? Some people will say yes right away, and that's worth respecting. But if you paused, even for a second before answering, that pause means something. That's the anchor letting you know it's still there. This isn't going to be a documentary that tells you to chase your dreams. Those words are worn out, and worn out words don't move anyone. Instead, we're going to go slower. We're going to go down one anchor at a time and actually look at what's under there. not to feel bad about it. Guilt has never lifted an anchor in the history of anchors. We're going to look at it because you can't loosen a knot you refuse to look at. Some of what we uncover is going to feel personal, not because it was written about you, but because these forces touch almost everyone. That's what makes them worth talking about. Fear doesn't care about your income. Comparison doesn't care about where you're from. Regret doesn't care about your age. By the end of this, the goal isn't for you to feel motivated for one afternoon and forget it by next week. The goal is for something to shift quietly in how you see your own hesitation. So the next time you feel that pull to stay still, you recognize it for what it actually is. Not fate, not timing, not who you are, just an anchor. And anchors, unlike most things that hold us back, can be lifted. Let's start with the one almost everything else is built on top of. The one so old and so well hidden that most people have stopped noticing it's even there. There's a moment almost everyone has lived through, even if the details are different. You're standing at the edge of something, a conversation you need to have, an application you need to send, a room you need to walk into, and your body starts doing things you didn't ask it to do. Your heart picks up speed, your palms get warm, some part of your brain starts producing reasons, quickly, urgently, for why now might not be the right moment after all. Most people call this nervousness. It's actually something much older and much smarter than that. Fear was never designed to stop you from living. It was designed to stop you from dying. For most of human history, the two were dangerously close together. A rustle in the grass could be wind. It could also be something with teeth. The humans who paused to check, who felt that jolt of alarm before thinking it through, were the ones who survived long enough to have descendants. The ones who didn't feel it, who walked toward every sound without hesitation, mostly didn't. So fear isn't a flaw in you. It's a gift from every ancestor you've ever had. The problem is that the gift was built for a world that doesn't exist anymore, and nobody sent it an update. Your brain still can't fully tell the difference between a lion and a difficult phone call. Both trigger the same ancient alarm system, buried deep in a part of the brain called the amygdala. It fires first and asks questions later. And to the amygdala, uncertainty itself looks like danger. It doesn't need a real threat, it just needs the unknown. This is why the fear of public speaking, something that has never physically hurt anyone in the way a predator would, can feel just as intense in the body as genuine danger. Some surveys have found people rank it above the fear of death itself. Not because standing on a stage is more dangerous than dying, because the brain doesn't grade fear by actual risk. It grades it by unfamiliarity and by the possibility of being watched and judged. Which brings us to something worth sitting with. Most of the fear that quietly runs your life today isn't about survival anymore. It's about exposure. Fear of failure isn't really about the failure itself. It's about what failure might reveal. That maybe you're not as capable as you hoped. That people might see it. That you might have to see it too. Fear of rejection isn't really about the no. It's about what the no might mean about your worth, if you let it mean anything at all. Fear of starting something new isn't really about the task. It's about the space between where you are and where you want to be. A space where for a while, you'll be undeniably bad at the thing you're trying to become good at. Here's a thought experiment worth trying. Picture the version of you that took the actual risk, sent the message, started the business, asked the question. Now, picture the worst realistic outcome, not the catastrophic, dramatized version your mind likes to build at 2 a.m. The actual, realistic worst case. In most situations, when people do this exercise honestly, they find the worst case is uncomfortable. Rarely is it unsurvivable. You'd feel embarrassed for a while, you'd have an awkward conversation, you'd need to try again. That's usually the ceiling. But your brain doesn't naturally sort fear by how survivable it is. It sorts by how uncertain it feels. And uncertainty to an ancient alarm system always looks worse than it actually is. There's a particular kind of fear worth naming directly because it's often the loudest one and the least discussed. It's not the fear of failing, it's the fear of succeeding and then discovering that success didn't fix what you thought it would. This one is quieter and stranger. Some people spend years chasing a goal, and the closer they get to it, the more they slow down. Not because the goal became less appealing, because reaching it means finding out whether they were right about themselves. If you never send the manuscript, You get to keep believing you might be a writer. If you send it and it's rejected, that belief is now something you have to defend, alone, without the comfort of maybe. Psychologists sometimes describe this as protecting a possible self. As long as the dream stays untested, it stays perfect. The moment you test it, it becomes real, and real things can be flawed. Some part of the mind would rather protect the fantasy than risk the outcome. This is one of the more uncomfortable truths about fear. Sometimes it isn't protecting you from pain, it's protecting an illusion. There's an old idea, often credited loosely to ancient Stoic thinking, that's worth bringing in here, not as a quote, but as a practice. The Stoics used to imagine the worst outcome deliberately, on purpose, in detail, before taking action, not to scare themselves, to take away fear's biggest weapon, which is vagueness. A fear you've actually looked at, named, and measured tends to lose most of its power. A fear you've only sensed from a distance in the dark keeps all of it. This matters because most people don't fight fear directly. They negotiate with it. They tell themselves they'll do the thing later, when they feel ready, when they have more information, when conditions are better. But readiness is a strange target to aim for, because fear doesn't actually go away once you have more information. It just finds a new place to attach itself. The entrepreneur who waits until they feel financially ready often finds a new reason to wait once the money arrives. The person who wants to have a hard conversation once they find the right words often discovers there's no perfectly right set of words, only a moment they eventually choose or don't. Confidence, it turns out, isn't usually the thing that comes before action. For most people, it's the thing that comes after. You don't feel ready and then act. You act, uncomfortable and uncertain, and confidence shows up afterward, as evidence that you survived. This is the part fear doesn't want you to notice. It tells you to wait until you're not afraid, but almost nobody stops being afraid before doing something meaningful. They just decide the fear isn't going to be the one making the decision. There's a difference between fear as information and fear as instruction. As information, fear is useful. It tells you something matters. It sharpens your attention. It's the reason your best work often comes right before a deadline that scared you into focus. As instruction, fear becomes something else entirely. It becomes the anchor, quiet, convincing, and dressed up as good judgment. The tragedy isn't that people feel fear. Everyone does, including the people you'd least expect. The tragedy is mistaking the feeling for a verdict, treating the jolt in your chest as proof that you shouldn't, instead of as a sign that you're standing exactly at the edge of something that matters. Because that edge is where all the interesting parts of a life tend to be. But fear rarely works alone. It has an old friend, one far gentler in appearance, far more persuasive in effect. Something that doesn't scream at you to stop. It simply makes staying still feel so pleasant that you forget you were ever supposed to move. Fear announces itself. You feel it coming. Your chest tightens. Your thoughts speed up. Something in you says, pay attention. Whatever this next anchor is, it doesn't do that. It doesn't warn you. It doesn't spike your heart rate. It arrives quietly, wrapped in something that feels good, and that's exactly what makes it so much harder to notice, let alone fight. Think about a Sunday evening. Nothing dramatic happened. You didn't fail at anything. You didn't get rejected. You just stayed in, watched something familiar, ate something familiar, talked to no one new, tried nothing new, risked nothing at all, and by the time you went to bed, you felt in a strange way, fine. That's the trick. Comfort doesn't feel like a problem while you're inside it. It only starts to feel like a problem later, usually much later, when you look back at a year or 5 years and notice how much of it looked exactly like the year before. There's a concept from psychology that explains part of this, and it's more interesting than it sounds. It's called the hedonic treadmill. The idea is that human beings are remarkably good at returning to a stable baseline of happiness, regardless of what happens to them. People who win the lottery report a temporary spike in happiness, and then often within a year settle back close to where they started. People who experience serious setbacks often do the same thing in reverse, adjusting back upward over time. At first glance, this sounds like good news, resilience essentially built into the species. But it has a darker side too. If your brain is constantly pulling you back toward a stable baseline, that includes pulling you back from the discomfort of growth and back toward the comfort of staying exactly where you already are. Growth almost always requires a temporary drop in comfort. New skills feel clumsy before they feel natural. New relationships feel uncertain before they feel safe. New identities feel like costumes before they feel like skin. The hedonic treadmill doesn't know the difference between discomfort that's dangerous and discomfort that's simply new. It just knows you've moved away from baseline, and it quietly, persistently tries to pull you back. Here's where it gets interesting. Comfort isn't actually the opposite of struggle. Comfort is the opposite of change. You can be deeply unhappy and still be comfortable, in the sense that matters here. A job you dislike but know exactly how to survive. A relationship that stopped growing years ago but has become so familiar that leaving feels scarier than staying. A daily routine that brings no real satisfaction but requires zero adjustment. None of these are pleasant. All of them are comfortable because comfort was never really about happiness. It was about the absence of the unknown. This is why so many people stay in situations that clearly aren't working for them. From the outside, it looks confusing. Why would someone choose an unhappy, familiar thing over an uncertain but potentially better one? But comfort was never asking whether you're happy. It was only ever asking whether you're safe from the discomfort of not knowing what comes next. There's a story, often told among psychologists studying behavior change, about elephants trained in captivity. When they're young, they're tied to a stake with a rope strong enough to hold them. They pull against it again and again, and fail again and again. Eventually they stop pulling. Not because they can't, because they've learned at that size, at that strength, that pulling doesn't work. Years later, as full-grown adults with more than enough strength to snap that same rope without effort, they still don't pull. The rope isn't holding them anymore. The memory of the rope is. Whether or not the story is entirely accurate in its details, the pattern it describes is very real in humans, and it has a name: learned helplessness. Once you've experienced enough situations where effort didn't change the outcome, some part of you stops trying, even in new situations where effort absolutely would work. The old rope becomes invisible. It simply becomes who you believe you are and what you believe is possible for you. Comfort thrives on this. It doesn't need to convince you that change is impossible. It only needs you to stop testing whether it still is. There's a useful distinction worth making here, because comfort is not by itself the enemy. Rest is not the enemy. A stable home, a predictable routine, a sense of safety, these things are not weaknesses to overcome. They're often what allow people to take risks at all. Nobody makes their boldest decisions from a place of chronic exhaustion or genuine instability. The distinction is between comfort as a foundation and comfort as a ceiling. Used well, comfort gives you the stability to take a risk. Used poorly, it becomes the reason you never do. You can usually tell the difference by asking a simple question. Is this comfort giving me energy for something, or is it quietly replacing the something entirely? There's a particular kind of comfort worth naming specifically, because it's become far more common in the last 2 decades than at any other point in history. It's the comfort of almost. Watching videos about people who built businesses without building one, reading about people who got fit without training, following the lives of people who took the leap without taking one yourself. This kind of comfort is especially dangerous because it feels like progress. You're learning, you're staying informed, you're inspired, but inspiration without action is just a very sophisticated way of staying still while feeling like you're moving. There's an old idea worth bringing back here, something sailors understood long before psychologists gave it a name. A ship in harbor is safe. That's not a controversial statement. Harbors exist because ships need them, but a ship was never built to stay in the harbor. Its entire design, every plank, every sail, exists in service of open water. A ship that never leaves isn't safe in any meaningful sense. It's simply decaying more slowly than it would at sea. This is worth sitting with, because it applies almost perfectly to a human life. Comfort, in the wrong dose, doesn't preserve you. It just slows down the rate at which you notice you've stopped growing. Here's something almost nobody says directly enough. Discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. In the context of growth, it's usually a sign that something is working. The muscle that's sore tomorrow is the muscle that got stronger today. The conversation that felt awkward is often the one that moved the relationship somewhere more honest. The version of you that feels slightly out of your depth is usually the version that's finally doing something worth doing. Comfort will never tell you this. Comfort's entire strategy depends on you believing that feeling okay right now is the same thing as being okay in general. It isn't. Sometimes feeling okay right now is exactly how a life quietly stalls, one perfectly pleasant, unremarkable day at a time. There's one more question worth asking honestly, and it's uncomfortable enough that most people avoid it. If nothing in your life changed from this exact moment forward, if the next 10 years looked exactly like the last one, repeated 10 times, would that be a life you'd choose, or a life you simply didn't resist? For a lot of people, sitting with that question honestly is the first real crack in the comfort. Not dramatic, not a breakdown, just a quiet, uncomfortable recognition that safety and stagnation had started to look identical, and nobody had pointed it out. But comfort rarely operates completely alone either. It has a partner, one that doesn't just keep you still, but actively convinces you that moving would be a mistake in the first place, using a source you'd almost never suspect. The people who claim to know you best. The problem, of course, is that we no longer live in small tribes where being disliked by 20 people could end your life. Most of us live surrounded by thousands, sometimes millions of opinions. Most from people who will never meet us, many from people who will forget they ever had that opinion about us within the hour. And yet the ancient alarm still fires exactly the same way it always did. Here's a thought experiment worth trying. Picture every person whose opinion has ever quietly stopped you from doing. There's a specific kind of memory almost everyone carries. Not a big trauma, not a dramatic event, just a sentence. Something someone said once, maybe years ago, maybe by someone who has probably forgotten they ever said it. You're not good at that. Who do you think you're kidding? That's not really you. Small words said once, maybe in passing, maybe without much thought behind them at all. And yet, for some reason, they didn't leave. They found a place to live, quietly, somewhere in the back of your mind, and they've been renting space there ever since, usually rent-free, usually for years. Here's what's strange about this. If you tried to remember what you had for lunch 2 Tuesdays ago, you probably couldn't. But that one offhand comment from a teacher, a parent, an ex, a stranger online, stayed with perfect clarity. Why does the brain do that? Why does it discard so much and hold on to that? Part of the answer goes back to the same ancient wiring we talked about with fear. For most of human history, being disliked by your group wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Humans didn't survive as individuals, they survived as tribes. Being cast out, rejected, talked about behind your back wasn't a social inconvenience. It could mean losing access to food, protection, and safety. The brain that took social rejection seriously was the brain that survived. The brain that shrugged it off often didn't get the chance to pass that shrug on to the next generation. So when someone criticizes you today, some ancient part of your mind doesn't process it as a mildly uncomfortable comment. It processes it as a potential threat to your place in the group. That's why a single piece of criticism can outweigh 10 pieces of praise in the way it sits with you afterward. Psychologists actually have a name for this pattern: negativity bias. Bad tends to be stronger than good, and it's not because you're weak. It's because for most of human history, paying close attention to bad news kept people alive. Something. Not people who gave you thoughtful, caring feedback because they wanted the best for you. Just the ones whose disapproval, real or imagined, made you shrink a little. Now try to remember honestly, how many of them are still thinking about you today? Most people, doing this exercise seriously, come to an uncomfortable realization. The relative who raised an eyebrow at your career choice has mostly moved on with their own life. The classmate who laughed at your idea has probably forgotten the conversation entirely. The stranger who left the cruel comment doesn't remember writing it. You are almost certainly the only person still holding on to it, turning it over, letting it shape decisions years later. There's an idea, sometimes summarized loosely, from the work of psychologist Elliot Aronson, that at any given moment, most people are so consumed by their own image, their own worries, their own unfinished business, that they're spending far less time thinking about you than you assume. Not because you don't matter, because everyone is the main character of their own life, and you are, at most, a background character in a scene they'll forget by dinner. This isn't meant as something bleak. It's meant to be freeing. If the audience you're so afraid of disappointing is mostly distracted, mostly self-focused, mostly not paying nearly as much attention as it feels like they are, then the weight you're carrying on their behalf is heavier than the thing you're actually carrying it for. There's a particular version of this anchor worth naming directly because it's grown sharper in the last 15 years. It's the audience that doesn't exist yet, but that you're already performing for. Before posting something, before starting something, before admitting something out loud, many people run an invisible simulation. What will they think? What will people say? How will this look? The strange part is that they is almost never a specific person. It's a vague, faceless jury assembled entirely inside your own head and given far more authority than any real person in your life would ever actually have. This imagined audience doesn't even need to be accurate to be powerful. It just needs to feel real enough to make you hesitate. There's an old story, sometimes told in different forms across different cultures, about a father, a son, and a donkey walking through a village. At first, the father rides while the son walks, and the villagers say the father is cruel for making the boy walk. So they switch, and the son rides while the father walks, and the villagers say the boy is disrespectful for making his father walk. So they both walk, and the villagers say they're fools for not riding the donkey at all. So they both ride, and the villagers say they're cruel to the donkey. By the end, having tried every possible configuration, they realized there was never a version of this walk that would have satisfied everyone. That story is centuries old, and it survived because it points at something that hasn't changed at all. There is no version of you, no decision, no path that will earn universal approval. Somebody somewhere will always have a critique. Trying to build a life that avoids every possible judgment isn't caution, it's a fool's task, one with no finish line, because the criteria keeps shifting depending on who's watching. Here's something worth separating clearly, because this anchor is often confused with something valuable. Listening to feedback, real feedback, from people who know you and care about your outcome is not the same as being controlled by opinion. A mentor pointing out a real weakness in your plan is a gift. A friend gently questioning a decision because they've seen you happier before is worth hearing. The anchor isn't feedback. The anchor is giving equal weight to a stranger's passing comment and a mentor's considered advice, simply because both came wrapped in someone else's judgment. The test is usually this: does this opinion come from someone who has earned the right to have a say in this part of your life? Through relationship, through experience, through genuine care for your outcome? Or does it come from someone whose approval you've never actually needed, but have somehow been auditioning for anyway? There's a particular kind of quiet courage in doing something you're not fully sure will be well received, and doing it anyway. Not out of stubbornness, but because you've actually done the work of deciding it matters to you. That courage doesn't come from silencing the voices around you completely. It comes from correctly sorting which voices deserve a vote, and which ones were only ever loud, not important. Because here's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of this. Most people who are afraid of being judged are not actually being judged nearly as much as they think. They're imagining a courtroom that in reality mostly emptied out a long time ago. And they're still standing there, defending themselves to an audience that left. But there's a deeper version of this anchor, one that doesn't come from other people at all, even imagined ones. It comes from a much closer source, a version of yourself you built a long time ago and never got around to updating. Somewhere, right now, there's a person turning down an opportunity, and the reason they'd give you, if you asked, would sound something like this: that's just not who I am. Not, I don't want to. Not, I'm afraid to. Just simply, that's not me. As if it were a fact about the universe, discovered rather than decided. This is worth pausing on because it's one of the strangest habits the human mind has. Somewhere along the way, usually early, usually without much evidence, you formed a set of conclusions about who you are. I'm not a confident person. I'm bad with money. I'm not creative. I'm just not someone who finishes things. And once those conclusions formed, something odd happened. You stopped treating them as opinions and started treating them as facts. Here's the problem. Almost none of these conclusions were formed the way facts should be formed. They weren't tested carefully across your whole life, in every context, over many years, and confirmed beyond doubt. Most of them were formed early, often in childhood, often from a small handful of experiences, sometimes just one, and then quietly generalized to cover the rest of your life. A child struggles with math once, gets a bad grade, and hears, directly or indirectly, that they're just not a math person. That single sentence, absorbed at 8 or 9 years old, can quietly steer someone away from entire careers decades later, not because it was true, but because it was said early enough and believed long enough to stop being questioned. Psychologist Carol Dweck spent decades researching exactly this pattern and named the underlying idea a fixed mindset, the belief that your abilities, your intelligence, your personality are essentially set traits discovered rather than developed. Compare that to what she called a growth mindset, the belief that most human capacities can be built through effort and practice. Her research found something worth taking seriously. People who believed their abilities were fixed tended to avoid challenges because failure felt like proof of a permanent limitation. People who believed abilities were built tended to seek out challenges because failure just meant they weren't there yet. Notice what's actually being measured here: not talent, not intelligence, a belief. And that belief on its own was enough to change how far people were willing to go. This is the strange power of identity. It doesn't just describe who you are, it quietly decides what you're willing to attempt. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine two people, identical in every measurable way, same intelligence, same resources, same opportunities. The only difference is what they believe about themselves. One believes they're the kind of person who follows through on things. The other believes they're the kind of person who starts strong and fades. Give them both the exact same difficult project. You already know, intuitively, which one is more likely to finish. Not because ability decided it, because identity did. This is worth taking seriously, because identity doesn't just influence behavior after the fact. It often decides behavior before anything even happens, quietly filtering which opportunities you even notice, let alone pursue. If you believe you're not a risk taker, you're less likely to notice the risk that was actually worth taking. It never even makes it to a conscious decision. It gets filtered out before you're aware there was a choice. Why does the person trying to eat healthier white-knuckle their way through a diet for 3 weeks and then collapse back into old habits, while another person seems to eat well without apparent effort? Often the difference isn't discipline, it's identity. One person is trying to force behavior that contradicts who they believe they are. The other person has quietly become someone for whom that behavior is simply normal. Forcing behavior against identity is exhausting, and exhausting things rarely last. Aligning behavior with identity barely requires effort at all, because it stops feeling like a fight. Here's where this gets more layered and more honest. Identity isn't only formed by what happened to you. It's also formed by the stories you kept telling about what happened to you. Two people can go through the exact same failure. One tells the story as "I failed because I wasn't ready yet, and I'll be more ready next time." The other tells it as "I failed because I'm not capable of this." Same event, two completely different identities being built from it. One brick at a time, story by story. This matters because most people don't examine their limiting beliefs directly. They just keep confirming them without realizing that's what they're doing. If you believe you're bad with people, you avoid social situations, which means you never build the skill, which means the belief keeps being technically true, which reinforces the belief further. This is sometimes called a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's one of the more elegant traps the mind builds for itself, because from the inside, it doesn't feel like a trap. It feels like evidence. There's a quieter, more uncomfortable version of this worth naming. Sometimes people cling to a limiting belief not because it's accurate, but because it's useful. If you believe you're simply not a disciplined person, you never have to feel the sting of trying hard at something and still falling short. The limiting belief, painful as it sounds, can actually function as a kind of protection. It lowers the stakes. If you never really tried, you never really failed. You just confirm something you already expected. This is worth being honest about, because it's rarely comfortable to admit. Sometimes the anchor isn't imposed on you, because letting go of it would mean facing the possibility that you actually could have done more and simply didn't. Here's something genuinely encouraging buried inside all of this, though. If identity is built from repeated stories and repeated evidence, then it can also be rebuilt the same way. Not through a single dramatic moment of transformation, the way movies like to portray it, but through small, repeated proof. Someone doesn't become disciplined by deciding to be disciplined. They become disciplined by doing one disciplined thing, noticing they did it, and letting that single piece of evidence slightly update the story, then doing it again and again. Identity shifts the same slow way it was built, brick by brick, not by demolition and a single new building appearing overnight. There's a small but important reframe worth trying here. Instead of asking, "Is this something I'm good at?" try asking, "Is this something I'm willing to practice being someone who does?" The first question treats ability as fixed, something you either have or don't. The second treats it as something under construction, something you're actively building through your own choices, one repetition at a time. Because in the end, most limiting beliefs aren't lies exactly. They're outdated conclusions formed by a younger, less experienced version of you, based on evidence that stopped applying a long time ago. The tragedy isn't that the belief was once true. The tragedy is that nobody ever went back to check whether it still was. But identity rarely stays still on its own either. It's shaped constantly by something else, something that happened, that can't be undone, and that a lot of people quietly carry as proof of exactly who they're not allowed to become. There's a particular kind of 3 a.m. thought almost everyone has had. Not about the future, about something that already happened, sometimes years ago, sometimes decades ago, replaying itself with a clarity that feels almost cruel in its precision. The thing you said, the person you hurt, the opportunity you let slip through your fingers because you were too scared, too slow, too young to know better. And even though it's over, even though there is nothing left to do about it, some part of you keeps returning to the scene as if enough replaying might finally change the ending. It won't, and somewhere you already know that, but knowing it doesn't seem to stop the replay. Here's what's worth understanding first. Regret isn't a malfunction. It's actually a fairly sophisticated piece of mental machinery, and researchers who study it, including psychologist Neil Rose, have found that it serves a real function. Regret is how the brain tries to learn from the past without having to repeat the mistake to learn the lesson. In that sense, it's useful. A person who feels genuine regret after breaking someone's trust is more likely to behave differently next time. Regret in small, functional doses is simply feedback. The trouble starts when the feedback loop never closes. When the lesson gets learned in the first 5 minutes and the replaying continues anyway, not to extract new information, but simply out of habit, long after there's nothing left to learn. There's an interesting finding from research into regret that surprises a lot of people. When researchers ask people later in life what they regret most, the answers are rarely about the mistakes they made. They're about the chances they didn't take. Psychologist Thomas Gilovich, who has studied this extensively, found that people tend to regret their inactions more than their actions, and that this gap widens over time. In the short term, people regret things they did, the embarrassing thing they said, the decision that backfired. But given enough distance, those regrets tend to fade. What doesn't fade nearly as easily is regret over the things that were never attempted at all. There's a reason for this, and it's almost mathematical in its logic. A mistake once made eventually resolves. You learn from it, you move past it, or time simply dulls its sharpness. But something you never did stays open-ended forever. There's no resolution to reach because there's no event to process, just an unanswered question that can be reopened at any point, indefinitely, precisely because it was never allowed to actually happen and finish. This is worth sitting with because it reframes what regret is actually protecting you from. Most people assume avoiding action protects them from future regret. Don't take the risk, and you won't have to regret it if it fails. But the research points in a different, more uncomfortable direction. The actions you didn't take tend to haunt you longer and more persistently than the ones that went wrong. Here's a thought experiment worth trying. Picture 2 versions of a decision you're currently avoiding. In one version, you try it, and it fails clearly and completely. In the other version, you never try it at all. Now imagine yourself 10 years from now in both scenarios. Which version of you seems to be carrying more weight? Most people, sitting with this honestly, find that the version who tried and failed has something the other doesn't. An ending, a closed loop, a story they can tell, even if it's not the story they wanted. The version who never tried has an open wound instead, one that reopens every time something reminds them of the road they didn't take. There's an old idea worth bringing in here, sometimes discussed under the phrase, the sunk cost fallacy, though it applies to regret in a slightly different way than it's usually used. The sunk cost fallacy describes the tendency to keep investing in something simply because you've already invested in it, even when it's no longer the right choice. Regret has a strange cousin of this pattern. People often keep replaying a past mistake, as though enough emotional investment in the replay might somehow retroactively change the outcome. It won't. The cost is sunk. The event happened. No amount of mental rehearsal moves it. What mental rehearsal does do, reliably, is keep the nervous system in a low-grade state of distress, associated with an event that has already ended. You're not protecting yourself from anything anymore. You're just paying the emotional cost of the mistake over and over without any of the original event actually still occurring. This is one of the more important distinctions to make here, because it's easy to confuse two very different mental activities that feel almost identical from the inside: reflection and rumination. Reflection looks at a past event, extracts something useful, and closes the loop. What did I learn? What would I do differently? What does this tell me about myself that's actually worth knowing? Reflection has a destination. Rumination replays the event without extracting anything new, over and over, often adding fresh guilt or shame each time, without ever arriving anywhere. Rumination has no destination. It's a loop that exists for its own sake, and the mind sometimes mistakes it for productive thinking, simply because it's thinking a great deal, even though nothing is actually being resolved. Here's a useful test to tell the difference. Ask yourself, has this thought taught me anything new in the last 10 times I've had it? If the answer is no, it's very likely no longer reflection. It's rumination dressed up as diligence. There's something worth naming about guilt specifically, because it plays a slightly different role than regret. Guilt, in healthy doses, is a social signal. It tells you when your actions have violated your own values, and it usually motivates repair, an apology, a change in behavior, an attempt to make something right. That version of guilt has a function, and once the repair happens, or once repair genuinely isn't possible anymore, guilt has done its job. But guilt can also curdle into something else, something that stops being about the specific action and starts becoming about your worth as a person entirely. There's a meaningful difference between "I did something wrong" and "I am something wrong," and a surprising number of people, without realizing it, quietly slide from the first into the second, and stay there far longer than the original event deserves. There's a phrase that captures something important here, often used loosely across different philosophical traditions. You are not the mistake you made. You are the person who is choosing, right now, what to do with having made it. This matters because a lot of people treat past mistakes as a kind of verdict on their character, permanently filed, impossible to appeal. But a mistake is an event. It happened at a specific time, under specific conditions, often with less information, less experience, and sometimes less maturity than you have now. Holding a past version of yourself to the standard of the person you've since become isn't fairness. It's a quiet, ongoing punishment for the crime of having once been less developed than you are today, which by definition, everyone has been. There's a strange comfort in this, if you let yourself sit with it. If regret is mostly about unfinished action, and rumination is mostly a loop without a destination, then the way out of both isn't more thinking. It's usually a small, specific act, making the amends that are actually still possible to make, extracting the one useful lesson and letting the rest go. Or in the case of the paths not taken, simply starting, imperfectly, late, awkwardly, but starting, so that the open loop finally closes, one way or another, instead of staying open indefinitely. Because the anchor here was never really the mistake itself. Mistakes end. The anchor is the refusal to let them. There's one more thing worth noticing about how the mind handles pain like this, something that connects directly to what comes next. When regret and guilt get heavy enough, most people don't sit with them for long. They reach, almost automatically, for relief. Something quick, something that makes the discomfort quiet down, even briefly. And it's worth asking, honestly, what that reach for relief has slowly turned into. You know the moment. You sit down to do something that actually matters. Write the report, study for the exam, start the project you've been putting off for weeks, and within 90 seconds, sometimes less, your hand is already reaching for your phone. Not because you decided to, but because some part of you moved before the rest of you noticed. You unlock it, scroll for a bit, put it back down, and somehow 20 minutes have disappeared, and you couldn't tell anyone, with real specificity, what you actually saw. This isn't a willpower problem, at least not primarily. It's closer to a wiring problem, and understanding the wiring is the only way to actually deal with it, rather than just feeling ashamed of it, which notably has never once fixed it for anyone. Here's what's actually happening in the brain. Dopamine, often misunderstood as the pleasure chemical, is more accurately described as the wanting chemical. Neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz, in a series of influential studies, found that dopamine doesn't spike when you get the reward. It spikes in anticipation of the reward, in the moment right before, when the outcome is still uncertain. This is a subtle but enormous distinction. Dopamine isn't primarily about satisfaction, it's about pursuit. This explains something that used to puzzle researchers. If dopamine were simply about pleasure, you'd expect the biggest spike to happen when you finally get what you wanted. Instead, the anticipation itself, the checking, the maybe, the not knowing what's on the other side of the notification, often produces a stronger response than the content you actually find there. This is precisely why a notification badge, before you've even opened the app, can create a small itch of anticipation. Your brain isn't responding to the message, it's responding to the possibility of one. Modern technology, whether by careful design or simple evolutionary pressure toward whatever keeps people engaged, has become extraordinarily good at exploiting exactly this mechanism. Every app with an infinite scroll, every platform with unpredictable rewards, some posts get many likes, some get few, is built on a principle researchers have understood since the 1950s, when psychologist B.F. Skinner studied what's called variable ratio reinforcement. Skinner's experiments involved pigeons and levers. When a pigeon received a reward every single time it pressed a lever, it pressed the lever at a steady, predictable pace. But when the reward came unpredictably, sometimes after one press, sometimes after 10, the pigeon pressed the lever obsessively, far more than it ever did under the predictable schedule. Uncertainty, it turns out, isn't just tolerated by a reward-seeking brain, it's actively more compelling than certainty. This is almost precisely how a social media feed works. You don't know which scroll will bring something interesting, something funny, something that makes you feel something. That uncertainty is not a flaw in the design. It is the design. Here's the part worth sitting with honestly. None of this makes you weak for struggling with it. You're not fighting a lack of discipline. You're fighting a mechanism that has been deliberately refined, over years, by extremely well-resourced teams whose measured success depends on how much of your attention they can hold. Pretending this is purely a personal failing ignores just how uneven that fight actually is. But understanding the mechanism doesn't make you immune to it either. It just gives you a more accurate map of what you're actually dealing with. There's a concept worth introducing here, one that researcher and psychiatrist Anna Lembke has written about extensively. She describes pleasure and pain as sitting on the same neurological seesaw. Every time you tip the seesaw toward pleasure, whether through sugar, social media, entertainment, or any other quick reward, the brain, in an effort to maintain balance, tips it back toward pain afterward, slightly more than before. This is why the scroll that felt good for the first few minutes often leaves you feeling flatter, more restless, or vaguely worse than when you started. Not because anything bad happened, because the seesaw is settling back to level, and settling back always slightly overshoots into the negative before returning to baseline. The deeper problem is what happens with repetition. Each time you tip that seesaw toward a quick reward, the baseline itself shifts slightly. The threshold for the same amount of pleasure creeps upward. What used to feel satisfying starts to feel merely okay. What used to feel okay starts to feel boring. This is sometimes described, in more clinical terms, as tolerance, and it explains a strange, quiet phenomenon a lot of people have felt without naming it. The sense that things which used to bring genuine enjoyment, a slow meal, a real conversation, a book, a walk without headphones, don't land the way they used to. This is worth naming plainly, because it's one of the more serious costs of this anchor, and it's rarely discussed directly. It's not just that instant gratification wastes time, it's that it can slowly recalibrate what enough feels like, making genuinely fulfilling, slower things feel less rewarding by comparison. purely because they can't compete on the same immediate, high-frequency terms. Here's where this connects to something we already looked at. Regret and guilt, as we discussed, tend to produce a kind of internal discomfort that many people instinctively want to quiet. Instant gratification is remarkably effective at quieting it, briefly, not resolving it, quieting it. This is part of why difficult emotions and compulsive scrolling so often travel together. The discomfort shows up, and rather than being processed, it gets muted by 45 seconds of something distracting, repeated as many times as necessary to avoid ever really sitting with it. This is the deeper cost that goes beyond wasted hours. Every time discomfort gets muted instead of processed, it doesn't disappear, it just waits, a little heavier, for the next quiet moment when there's nothing left to distract from it. There's a useful reframe worth trying here, borrowed loosely from behavioral research on delayed gratification, most famously studied through Walter Mischel's experiments involving children, marshmallows, and the difficult choice between one treat now or two treats later. What Mischel's research, and decades of follow-up research since, generally found was that the capacity to tolerate the discomfort of waiting correlated with a wide range of better outcomes later in life, not because delaying gratification is a virtue in itself, but because most things genuinely worth having, deep relationships, real skill, meaningful achievement, simply require time and require tolerating discomfort during the waiting. This doesn't mean every quick pleasure is a problem. A short break, an enjoyable show, a genuine moment of fun, these aren't the anchor. The anchor is when quick reward becomes the default response to any discomfort at all, no matter how small, until the muscle required to sit with discomfort, the same muscle needed to write the difficult chapter or have the hard conversation, or build the slow skill, quietly atrophies from disuse. There's a specific practice worth mentioning, one that Lemke and others in this field often recommend, sometimes called a dopamine reset, though the phrase itself has become somewhat overused. The actual practice is simpler than the phrase suggests, deliberately abstaining from the highest frequency, highest stimulation habits for a period, long enough for the baseline to recalibrate downward again, so that slower, quieter sources of satisfaction can start to register as satisfying again. It's uncomfortable in the first few days, often surprisingly uncomfortable, which itself tells you something about how far the baseline had drifted. Here's the honest question worth asking yourself, without judgment, just observation. When was the last time you sat with genuine boredom, no phone, no screen, no background noise for more than 5 minutes, and simply let your own mind wander without reaching for something to interrupt it? For a lot of people, that question is harder to answer than it should be. And that difficulty itself is worth noticing, not as a failure, as information about exactly where this particular anchor has quietly settled into your life. But this anchor rarely operates in isolation either. Often underneath the scrolling, underneath the reaching for quick relief, there's another pull happening at the same time, one that measures your life not against your own progress, but against everyone else's highlight reel, scrolling by in the very same feed. There's a specific kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep. You wake up fine, you go through your morning fine, and then, at some point, often without meaning to, you see someone else's life. A new job, a new relationship, a body that looks different from yours. A life that, from the outside, looks like it's further along than yours. And something in you just deflates, quietly, not dramatically. Just a small drop in energy you can't quite explain, attached to a day that, 5 minutes earlier, had been perfectly fine. This is worth taking seriously, because it happens to almost everyone, and almost nobody talks about how strange it actually is. You didn't lose anything. Nothing about your life changed in that moment, and yet you feel, somehow, poorer than you did before you looked. The mechanism behind this has a name, and it's older than social media, older than television, older than most of the technology we blame it on. In 1954, psychologist Leon Festinger proposed what he called social comparison theory. His central idea was simple, and a little unsettling. Humans don't evaluate how they're doing in life using objective, absolute measures. There's no built-in gauge that tells you, on its own, whether your career, your relationship, or your body is good. Instead, the mind evaluates almost everything relative to other people. You don't ask, "Am I doing well?" You ask, am I doing well compared to them? This made a certain kind of sense in the world Festinger was studying. If you lived in a small village, your comparison group was maybe a few dozen people, most of whom you actually knew, most of whom had lives roughly similar in shape to yours, dealing with similar constraints, similar setbacks, similar timelines. The comparison group most people carry around today looks nothing like that. It's not a few dozen neighbors, it's potentially everyone. Every peer from school, whether or not you actually kept in touch. Every stranger whose curated highlight reel happens to appear in your feed. Every person on earth who happens to be at this exact point in their life, doing the specific thing you wish you were doing, presented without any of the years of struggle, luck, or context that got them there. This is the part we're sitting with. When Festinger described social comparison, he was describing a mechanism built for a world with a small, mostly accurate sample size. That mechanism hasn't been updated. It's still running exactly as it always did. It's just been handed an input it was never designed for. A nearly infinite stream of curated, filtered, best moment examples, treated by the ancient part of your brain as though they were an accurate representative sample of what normal looks like. There's a specific distortion worth naming precisely, because it explains why comparison feels so uniquely draining, more draining often than it should be, given what's actually happening. You are comparing your entire, lived, full context life, all the boring parts, the bad days, the doubts, the moments no one filmed, against someone else's highlight reel, a curated collection of their best 30 seconds, stripped of everything difficult that led up to it. This isn't a fair fight, and it was never supposed to be one. It's the equivalent of comparing a full, unedited documentary of your life against someone else's movie trailer, and feeling inadequate that your documentary has slow parts. Here's a thought experiment worth trying. Picture the person you compare yourself to most often. Now imagine you had access, not to their highlight reel, but to their actual full, unedited experience. Every anxious night, every doubt, every relationship struggle, every quiet failure they never mentioned. Would you still want to trade your whole life for theirs, in full, or only for the specific slice you've been shown? Most people doing this exercise honestly realize they've never actually been envious of a whole life. They've been envious of a highlight, stripped of its cost, and mistaken it for the whole picture. There's a particular type of comparison worth naming separately, because it operates differently and it's worth understanding on its own terms. Psychologists sometimes distinguish between upward comparison, comparing yourself to someone who seems to be doing better, and downward comparison, comparing yourself to someone who seems to be doing worse. Downward comparison tends to produce a brief boost in mood, though it's a hollow one, built on someone else's hardship rather than your own growth. Upward comparison tends to produce either of two very different responses, and the difference between them matters enormously. Sometimes upward comparison becomes what researchers call inspirational. Seeing someone further along becomes proof of what's possible, and it motivates effort. Other times, the exact same comparison becomes what's simply called demoralizing. Seeing someone further along becomes proof of a gap that feels too large to close, and it produces withdrawal instead of effort. Here's what's interesting. The outside event, seeing someone doing better than you, is often identical in both cases. What differs is a single internal variable, whether the gap feels closable through your own effort or fixed and out of your control. This single perception, more than almost anything else, seems to determine whether comparison becomes fuel or becomes a slow leak. This matters because it points towards something genuinely useful, rather than just the usual advice to stop comparing yourself to others, which sounds nice and almost never works, because the mechanism, as we've seen, is old, automatic, and not something most people can simply switch off through willpower. A more honest, more workable goal is not to eliminate comparison, but to change what you're comparing. There's an old craftsman's principle, sometimes attributed to different traditions, that offers a cleaner target. Compare the wood you're carving today to the wood you were carving yesterday, not to someone else's finished sculpture. This reframe matters, because your own past self is the only comparison point that shares your exact starting conditions, your exact constraints, your exact history, and it happens to be the only one that reliably produces motivation instead of despair, because the gap, by definition, is always closable. You've already closed it before, simply by getting from yesterday to today. There's something worth acknowledging honestly here too. Comparison isn't purely destructive by nature. In careful doses, it's part of how humans learn what's possible at all. A young athlete watching someone more skilled isn't necessarily being harmed by that comparison. They're being shown a version of a skill they didn't know was achievable, and that can genuinely expand what they attempt next. The anchor is unconscious, constant, involuntary comparison, run against an inaccurate, curated sample, without ever checking whether the comparison is even a fair one to begin with. There's a quiet discipline worth building here, one that doesn't require deleting every app or moving to a village. It's simply the habit of noticing the moment comparison happens, and asking, out loud if needed, is this a fair comparison? Am I comparing my full lived experience to someone else's highlight? Am I comparing myself to a version of them that even exists? Or to an edited fragment designed to look effortless? Because underneath almost all comparison-driven suffering is the same quiet error. Measuring your entire life against someone else's most flattering angle, and calling the result an honest reflection of where you stand. There's one more version of this anchor worth mentioning, because it's subtler, and in some ways more dangerous than comparing yourself to others. It's the comparison you run, silently, against a version of yourself that was never allowed to make a single mistake in the first place. There's a folder, or a notebook, or a drawer that a lot of people have without ever calling it what it is. Half-written books, business plans that never got past the first page, songs recorded once and never finished, ideas that were good enough to start and somehow never good enough to continue. Ask most people why, and you'll rarely hear "I was afraid." You'll usually hear something closer to "it just wasn't ready yet." And that sentence, innocent as it sounds, is often the exact place where this particular anchor lives. Perfectionism has a strange reputation. In a lot of professional settings, people say it almost proudly, "I'm just a perfectionist," as though it were a mild personality quirk or even a virtue, high standards taken slightly too far. But researchers who actually study perfectionism closely have found something less flattering underneath it. Psychologist Brené Brown, who has written extensively on this, makes an important distinction. Healthy striving is self-focused. It asks, how can I improve? Perfectionism is other-focused, whether or not the person realizes it. It asks, what will they think? Striving is about growth. Perfectionism, underneath its polished surface, is usually about protection, specifically protection from judgment, from shame, from the possibility of being seen as not enough. This reframes what perfectionism actually is. It's not really about high standards. Plenty of people have high standards and finish things anyway. Perfectionism is what happens when the fear of judgment gets so tightly fused to the standard that finishing, and therefore being seen, becomes more threatening than never finishing at all. Here's the part that makes this especially difficult to notice in yourself. Perfectionism rarely announces itself as fear. It disguises itself as diligence. It doesn't say, "I'm scared to show this to anyone." It says, "This section still needs work." It doesn't say, "I'm afraid of what they'll think." It says, "I just want to get it right." Every one of these thoughts might, on any given day, be completely true and reasonable. The trouble is that perfectionism uses them as an infinite excuse, because there is no draft, no plan, no piece of work in existence that couldn't, in theory, use a little more polish. This is worth sitting with, because it points to something almost mathematically true about perfection as a target. Perfect isn't a high bar. It's not a bar at all. It's a moving target with no fixed position, which means it can never actually be reached, only endlessly approached, which conveniently and often unconsciously gives perfectionism an unlimited supply of reasons to delay. Researcher Thomas Curran, who has studied trends in perfectionism across generations, found something worth taking seriously. Perfectionism, particularly the kind driven by a fear of others' judgment, has been rising steadily among young people over the past few decades. His research points to a culture that increasingly measures worth through visible, comparable metrics, achievement, appearance, output, on ever more public stages. This connects directly to something we already looked at. If your comparison group has grown from a small village to effectively everyone, then the bar for what counts as good enough has been quietly rising the entire time, often without you consciously deciding it should. Here's a thought experiment worth trying. Picture the thing you've been perfecting the longest, the project sitting furthest from completion, gathering the most revisions with the least amount of actual release. Now, ask yourself honestly, is the remaining work actually about quality, or has quality become a very convincing disguise for a much more uncomfortable question, which is simply, am I ready to be judged on this? For a lot of people, sitting with that question produces a small, uncomfortable flicker of recognition, because the truth often is that the work reached good enough a while ago. What hasn't reached good enough is the perfectionist's tolerance for the vulnerability of releasing it. There's a concept worth introducing here, sometimes called the paradox of finished versus perfect. Perfectionism assumes that a finished, imperfect piece of work is worse than an unfinished, theoretically perfect one. But this only holds up if the unfinished piece genuinely has a chance of becoming perfect eventually, and it doesn't, because perfect, as established, isn't a real destination. Which means the actual comparison isn't finished but imperfect versus eventually perfect. It's finished but imperfect versus never finished at all. Framed that way, the math changes considerably. There's a well-known account often cited in creativity research, sometimes attributed to art teacher Jerry Ullman and popularized further by author David Bayless, describing a ceramics class split into two groups. One group was told they'd be graded purely on quantity, the sheer number of pots they produced by the end of the term. The other group was told they'd be graded purely on quality, and only needed to produce a single pot, but it needed to be excellent. At the end of the term, something counterintuitive happened. The best pots, by every measure, came from the quantity group. The quality group had spent the term theorizing about what perfection might look like, while the quantity group spent the term actually making things, failing, adjusting, and improving through sheer repetition. Whether the specific numbers of that story have grown a little in the retelling over the years, the underlying pattern it illustrates is well supported elsewhere. Mastery tends to come from volume and iteration, not from theorizing your way toward an ideal first attempt. Perfectionism, in trying to protect you from a bad first attempt, often prevents the very repetition that would have made your work genuinely better. There's an important distinction worth making here too, because perfectionism is easy to confuse with something valuable, the same way comfort was easy to confuse with peace. Craftsmanship, care, attention to detail, these aren't the problem. A surgeon should be a perfectionist about certain things. The distinction isn't about caring deeply. It's about whether that care has a stopping point, a definition of done that's actually achievable, or whether it's quietly become endless, moving further away exactly as you get closer to it. A useful practice, borrowed loosely from a principle sometimes used in software development, is defining good enough before you start, rather than after. Deciding in advance what specific, achievable standard would count as finished, and treating that standard as a real destination rather than a compromise. This matters because perfectionism thrives specifically in the absence of a defined finish line. Without one, the mind will always find a plausible reason the work isn't quite there yet, because without a fixed target, not quite there yet can be argued about literally forever. Here's something worth naming plainly, because it rarely gets said this directly. The world does not remember polished things that never left a drawer. It remembers imperfect things that were released and then improved in public over time. Almost everything anyone admires as excellent today went through an early, unimpressive version that its creator was at the time embarrassed by. The difference between the people whose work reached the world and the people whose work stayed in the drawer usually isn't talent. It's usually just a willingness to let something exist before it was ready to be judged as excellent. Perfectionism will tell you convincingly that waiting protects your reputation. But an idea that never leaves the drawer doesn't protect your reputation. It simply ensures you never build one in the first place. There's one more thing worth noticing because it connects to something that often runs quietly underneath perfectionism and underneath comparison too. Both tend to intensify sharply around people who don't just judge the work, but who seem to drain something from you every time you're near them, whether or not the work ever comes up at all. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from work, or from lack of sleep, or from anything you can point to directly. It comes from a phone call, a visit, a conversation with someone you've known for years, someone you'd probably still call a friend, or family, or a partner, if anyone asked. And afterward, without anything dramatic having happened, you feel smaller than you did before. Nobody yelled. Nobody said anything you could quote back as obviously cruel, and yet somehow, you feel like you're carrying something heavier than you were an hour ago. This is worth naming carefully, because the word toxic gets thrown around loosely enough now that it's started to lose its precision. Not every difficult relationship is toxic. Not every disagreement is a red flag. Healthy relationships involve friction, honesty, disagreement, and sometimes disappointment, and none of that on its own makes a relationship harmful. The distinction worth making isn't about whether a relationship is difficult sometimes. It's about the direction of the pattern, over time, across many interactions, not just one bad day. Psychologist John Gottman, who has spent decades studying relationships, identified specific patterns that reliably predict whether a relationship is heading toward collapse. He called them somewhat memorably the four horsemen. Criticism, aimed at character rather than behavior. Contempt, communicated through mockery, sarcasm, or a tone of superiority. Defensiveness, refusing to take any accountability, ever. And stonewalling, shutting down and withdrawing entirely rather than engaging. Gottman's research found that of these four, contempt was the single strongest predictor of a relationship's failure, more predictive than conflict itself. Interestingly, the presence of conflict wasn't the danger. Plenty of strong relationships have frequent conflict. The danger was the presence of contempt, a quiet, corrosive sense that one person looks down on the other. This matters because it reframes what actually makes a relationship harmful. It's rarely the disagreements themselves. It's whether underneath the disagreements, there's a baseline of respect, or a baseline of erosion. Here's a thought experiment worth trying, one that therapists sometimes use with clients who struggle to name what's actually happening in a difficult relationship. Picture the version of yourself that exists right after spending time with this person. Not who you are in general, just that specific version, right after. Is that version more confident or less? More open or more guarded? Closer to who you actually want to be or further from it? This question works because it bypasses the confusing surface details, who said what, who's technically right, and gets straight to something more honest and harder to argue with. The measurable effect the relationship has on you, repeated over time. There's a particular pattern worth naming specifically because it's subtle enough that people inside it often don't recognize it until years have passed. It doesn't look like obvious cruelty. It looks like a slow, repeated erosion of confidence, dressed up as honesty, or humor, or concern. A comment about your appearance, framed as a joke. A dismissal of your ambitions, framed as realism. A pattern of making you doubt your own memory of events, sometimes called gaslighting, a term that's become overused, but that describes something very real when it actually occurs. A repeated pattern of denying someone's experience so consistently that they start to distrust their own perception of reality. What makes these patterns especially hard to see from the inside is that they rarely happen all at once. Nobody sits down on day one and behaves this way outright. It happens gradually, one small comment at a time, each one small enough on its own to seem like an overreaction to name. This is, in a strange way, similar to a principle sometimes described using frogs in boiling water, a metaphor that isn't biologically accurate. Frogs would in fact jump out, but that survives because the underlying human pattern it describes is real. Gradual harm is far harder to notice and far harder to leave than sudden harm, precisely because there's never one clear moment that justifies the exit. There's a psychological concept worth introducing here, sometimes called the sunk cost fallacy, applied to relationships specifically. The longer you've invested in a relationship, the harder it becomes to leave, not because the relationship is good, but because leaving would mean acknowledging that the years already spent were in some sense a loss. This creates a strange trap. The worse a relationship gets, the more time has usually already been invested in it, and the more time invested, the harder it feels to walk away, precisely at the moment walking away would matter most. Here's something important to separate clearly, because this anchor is easy to misapply if it's not handled carefully. Not every difficult period in a relationship means it should end. People go through hard seasons. Good relationships survive misunderstandings, bad days, periods of real strain, and often come out stronger for having worked through them honestly. The anchor isn't difficulty. The anchor is a pattern, repeated over enough time, where the relationship consistently costs you more than it gives, where the difficult moments aren't occasional weather, but the actual climate. There's a distinction worth making between people who challenge you and people who diminish you, because they can look confusingly similar in the moment. Someone who challenges you might say something uncomfortable, but it leaves you with something afterward. A new perspective, a genuine question worth sitting with, a version of care that's rough around the edges but still, underneath, oriented toward your good. Someone who diminishes you might say something that sounds similar on the surface, but leaves you with nothing except a smaller sense of yourself. The test isn't how the comment felt in the moment. Both can feel uncomfortable. The test is what it leaves behind. There's a quiet phenomenon worth naming as well. One that explains why people sometimes stay in relationships that clearly aren't serving them, even when they can see it clearly from the outside, looking at someone else's situation. It's called the mere exposure effect, first studied extensively by psychologist Robert Zajonc, and it describes a simple but powerful pattern. Familiarity itself increases liking, independent of whether the familiar thing is actually good for you. This means a long-term relationship, even a genuinely harmful one, can start to feel safer than an unfamiliar alternative, purely because of its familiarity, not because of its quality. The brain conflates known with safe, even when known is, by any honest measure, not safe at all. This connects to something we touched on earlier, with comfort. A familiar harm can feel, in the moment, more bearable than an unfamiliar uncertainty, even when the unfamiliar uncertainty is, in every meaningful way, the better option. This is part of why leaving a relationship that clearly isn't working can feel so disproportionately difficult. You're not just weighing the relationship itself, you're fighting the brain's ancient preference for the known over the unknown, the exact same mechanism that made comfort so powerful an anchor to begin with. Here's something worth saying plainly, because it's the kind of thing that's often true, but rarely said directly enough. You are allowed to outgrow relationships that once mattered to you, without that meaning the relationship or the person or the years you spent were a mistake. Growth sometimes means the people around you no longer match where you're heading, not because they did anything wrong, and not because you did either. Sometimes two people simply grow in different directions, and staying loyal to who someone used to be, at the cost of who you're becoming, isn't loyalty, it's just another form of staying still. There's one more anchor worth naming here, quieter than any of the ones we've covered, because it doesn't come from other people at all, and it doesn't come from circumstances either. It comes from the simple, unremarkable passage of days that never seem to add up to anything you can point to and call a direction. There's a question that seems simple, almost too simple to matter, until you actually try to answer it honestly. Why are you doing what you're doing with your days? Not your job title, not your 5-year plan if you have one. Just underneath all of it, why? Most people ask this directly, reach for something practical. I need to pay rent. It's what came next after school. It's just what you do. All true, all reasonable, and all, if you notice, answers about circumstance rather than answers about direction. This is worth sitting with, because there's a difference between a life that's busy and a life that's purposeful, and the two get confused constantly. Busy just means the hours are filled. Purposeful means the hours are pointed somewhere. You can have an extremely full calendar and still, underneath it, feel a low, persistent hum of, what is all this actually for? And that hum, quiet as it is one of the more corrosive anchors of all, precisely because it doesn't look like a problem from the outside. It looks like a functioning life. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived internment in Nazi concentration camps during the Second World War, wrote about this more directly than almost anyone before or since. In his account, later published as Man's Search for Meaning, he observed something striking among the people he lived alongside in the camps. Physical suffering was, in a horrifying way, roughly comparable for everyone. But psychological survival wasn't equally distributed. Frankl noticed that those who maintained some sense of meaning, whether it was a person they hoped to see again, a piece of work left unfinished, or simply a reason they'd constructed for enduring another day, tended to endure the unbearable in ways that others facing identical physical conditions often couldn't. His conclusion, distilled from that experience, was that humans can tolerate almost any what, if they have a clear enough why. This wasn't an abstract philosophical claim for Frankl. It was something he watched play out repeatedly in the most extreme conditions imaginable. Most people will never face anything close to what Frankl witnessed, but the underlying mechanism he identified doesn't require extreme suffering to apply. It applies just as much to an ordinary Tuesday. A demanding job becomes bearable, even energizing, when it's connected to a clear why. The exact same job, identical in every practical detail, becomes draining and hollow when that why has quietly gone missing. Here's what makes lack of purpose different from most of the other anchors we've covered. Fear has a clear trigger. Comparison has a clear trigger, usually someone else's life appearing in front of you. Lack of purpose often has no trigger at all. It just accumulates, slowly, in the space between tasks. In the quiet moments, when nothing urgent demands your attention, and you're left, briefly, with the question of what you're actually building toward. This is why a lot of people manage to avoid confronting it for years. Purpose is easy to postpone, precisely because its absence doesn't create an emergency. Nobody gets fired for lacking purpose. No relationship ends over it directly. It just sits there, quietly, underneath a life that otherwise appears to be functioning fine, until enough years pass that the absence itself becomes the defining feature. There's a distinction worth making here because purpose is a word that's been stretched thin by overuse, often into something that sounds grand, a single capital P purpose that you're supposed to discover, fully formed, like a hidden destiny waiting to be uncovered. Psychologist William Damon, who has researched purpose extensively, particularly in young people, defines it more practically. Purpose, in his framing, is a stable, generalized intention to accomplish something that is at once meaningful to the self and consequential for the world beyond the self. Notice what's absent from that definition. There's no requirement that it be extraordinary. There's no requirement that it be permanent, singular, or discovered in a single dramatic moment. It simply needs two things. It needs to matter to you, and it needs to matter beyond you. This reframes the search for purpose into something far more achievable than the dramatic version culture often sells. You're not searching for the one true calling, hidden somewhere, waiting to be found through enough introspection. You're building a direction, piece by piece, usually through action rather than through thinking your way there in advance. Here's a thought experiment worth trying. Picture the moments in the last year when time seemed to move differently, faster in a good way, where you looked up and found that hours had passed without you noticing. Psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi studied this state extensively and called it flow, a state of full absorption in an activity that's challenging enough to require focus, but matched closely enough to your ability that it doesn't produce anxiety. His research found that people report their highest levels of satisfaction not during leisure or rest, counterintuitively, but during these states of absorbed engagement. This matters here because flow states are often clues, small, specific personal evidence pointing toward what a broader sense of purpose might actually be built from. Purpose rarely announces itself as a single grand answer. It usually shows up first as these smaller signals, repeated activities that consistently produce this kind of absorption, and that consistently connect, even loosely, to something beyond your own immediate comfort. There's a common trap worth naming directly, because it stops a lot of people before they even start looking. The belief that purpose needs to be discovered before you can act on it, as though it's sitting somewhere complete, waiting to be found through enough reflection. In practice, purpose tends to work the other way around. It's usually clarified through action, not before it. You try something, notice whether it produces that pull toward absorption and meaning, adjust, try again, and slowly through iteration rather than revelation, a direction starts to take shape. Waiting for total clarity before beginning is often just another disguised form of the perfectionism we already looked at, applied now to an entire life instead of a single project. Here's something worth being honest about, because it's rarely said plainly enough. Purpose doesn't need to be permanent to be real. A lot of people resist committing to any direction because they're afraid of choosing wrong, afraid that whatever they pick now will lock them in forever. But most people who've lived long, purposeful lives didn't have one static purpose from age 20 to 80. They had a series of purposes, each one genuine and consuming while it lasted, evolving as they did. The fear of choosing the wrong purpose keeps a lot of people from choosing any purpose at all, which guarantees a worse outcome than choosing imperfectly and adjusting later ever could. There's a quiet, uncomfortable question worth sitting with here, one that tends to cut through a lot of the noise around this topic. If you knew with certainty that no one would ever find out, that there would be no recognition, no praise, no audience at all, what would you still choose to spend your time building? The answer to that question for a lot of people strips away the performance layer that's crept into so much of modern ambition, the version of purpose that's actually about being seen pursuing something impressive rather than about the thing itself. What's left underneath that layer is usually closer to the truth. There's one more anchor left before we reach the ones that tend to sit closest to the surface of everything we've already discussed. It's subtler than lack of purpose, and in some ways more stubborn, because unlike purpose, it doesn't feel like an absence. It feels like strength. It shows up, quietly, every time you'd rather be right than be honest. There's a moment almost everyone recognizes, even if they don't like admitting it. Someone points out that you're wrong, not cruelly, not even unfairly often, and before you've even had time to actually consider whether they might be right, something in you is already building a defense. It happens fast, faster than thought almost. A flash of heat, a tightening somewhere in the chest, and a voice, quiet but insistent, that isn't asking is this true, but is instead already constructing the case for why it isn't. This is worth examining closely, because it's one of the strangest things about being human. You'd think logically that being shown you're wrong about something would simply be useful information, a free correction, a chance to be more accurate going forward. And in theory it is. But in practice, for most people, most of the time, it doesn't feel like a gift. It feels like an attack. The reason traces back to something psychologists call the self-concept, essentially the internal story you carry about who you are. Being wrong about a fact should logically threaten nothing but the fact itself. But somewhere in the wiring of most human minds, being wrong about what you believe gets fused with being wrong about who you are. As though every opinion were a small extension of your identity, and every correction were in some small way a correction of your worth. This fusion is the entire mechanism behind ego, at least in the sense that matters here. Not ego as confidence, and not ego as arrogance exactly, though it often produces both. Ego in this sense is simply the reflex to defend the self, even when defending the self means defending something that isn't actually true. Psychologist Leon Festinger, whose work on social comparison we already touched on, also did foundational research on a related concept called cognitive dissonance. The idea is that holding two conflicting beliefs at once, especially one that threatens your sense of self, produces genuine psychological discomfort real enough that the mind will often distort the evidence itself, rather than sit with it. Festinger's most famous study involved a small group that believed the world would end on a specific date. When the date passed and nothing happened, you might expect the group to abandon the belief. Instead, many of them became more convinced than before, reinterpreting the failed prediction as evidence that their faith had actually saved the world. The discomfort of being wrong was so intense that reality itself got reshaped to avoid it. Most people will never join a doomsday group, but the same mechanism in a much smaller, quieter form runs constantly beneath ordinary disagreements. It's why an argument about something genuinely minor, whose turn it was to do a chore, the correct route to a restaurant, can escalate far beyond what the actual stakes justify. The argument was never really about the chore or the route. It became almost instantly about which person's account of reality was going to be treated as correct, and therefore whose sense of self was going to remain intact. Here's a distinction worth making, because it clarifies what's actually happening in these moments. There's a difference between defending an idea and defending yourself through an idea. Defending an idea means engaging with the actual argument, the evidence, the logic, genuinely open to the possibility that the idea might not hold up. Defending yourself through an idea means the idea has become a proxy for your worth, and any challenge to it registers physically as a challenge to you. The tell usually is in how quickly the conversation shifts from, "Is this true?" to "How dare you suggest I'm wrong?" That shift is ego doing its work, quietly converting a disagreement about facts into a battle over status. There's a thought experiment worth sitting with here. Picture the last argument you had where you dug in, refused to budge, even as some quiet part of you suspected the other person might have a point. Now ask honestly what you were actually protecting. Was it the accuracy of your position? Or was it the discomfort of admitting out loud in front of someone else that you'd been wrong? For most people, being honest with this exercise reveals something uncomfortable. The stakes of being factually correct were usually small. The stakes of being seen as wrong in front of another person felt enormous, disproportionately so, given what was actually being argued about. This connects directly to something worth naming plainly because it's rarely said this bluntly. Ego doesn't actually protect you. It protects a version of you, a curated, unblemished self-image, at the direct cost of your actual growth. Every time ego wins an argument you were actually wrong about, you gain nothing except the temporary relief of not having to feel small. What you lose is the correction itself, the information that could have made you genuinely better at the thing you were arguing about. There's an idea worth introducing here, something philosopher and computer scientist Marvin Minsky described in a slightly different context, but that applies well to this specific trap. He suggested that you don't fully understand something until you understand it well enough to see what's wrong with it. Applied here, the principle becomes something like this. You don't actually know your own position is correct until you've genuinely, honestly entertained the possibility that it isn't, and let that possibility survive contact with the strongest version of the opposing argument, rather than a version you've quietly weakened in advance to make it easier to dismiss. Ego resists this deeply because genuinely entertaining the opposing argument means, briefly, living with the uncomfortable possibility that you might have to change your mind, publicly, in front of someone who's watching. Here's something worth separating clearly, because this anchor is easy to confuse with self-respect, the same way perfectionism was easy to confuse with craftsmanship. Having standards, having convictions, defending something you've genuinely thought through carefully, none of that is ego. The distinction lies in flexibility. A position held with confidence but without ego can update the moment better evidence arrives. A position fused with ego treats new evidence as an attack to survive rather than information to absorb. There's a quiet kind of strength worth naming here, one that looks on the surface like weakness, but functions as almost the opposite. The ability to say cleanly, without excessive apology or excessive drama, "You're right, I hadn't considered that." Most people flinch from this because it feels in the moment like losing, but there's a strange reversal that happens for anyone who practices it enough. Being visibly willing to update your position in front of other people doesn't make you look weak. It tends to make you look more credible, precisely because it signals that your other positions, the ones you haven't updated, have actually survived real scrutiny rather than simply being defended out of habit. There's a final thing worth naming about ego, because it explains why it's one of the more persistent anchors on this list. Ego doesn't just distort how you handle disagreement with others, it distorts your relationship with time itself, quietly convincing you that there's always more of it ahead, always another chance to become the person you keep intending to be, right up until, for some people, there suddenly isn't. There's a sentence almost everyone has said to themselves, in one form or another, and almost nobody notices how strange it actually is. Not now, later, when things settle down, next year. It sounds harmless, reasonable even. Timing matters, and not everything needs to happen today. But said often enough, across enough years, that sentence becomes something else entirely. It becomes the quiet architecture of an entire unlived life, built one reasonable postponement at a time. Here's what makes this anchor different from all the others we've discussed. Fear, comfort, comparison, ego, all of them operate on a false belief about the present moment. This one operates on a false belief about the future. Specifically, the belief that the future is guaranteed, spacious, and largely under your control, when in fact it's none of those three things, not reliably, not for anyone. Psychologists have studied a specific bias that explains part of this, called the planning fallacy, first documented extensively by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Their research found that people consistently underestimate how long tasks will take and consistently overestimate how much they'll accomplish in a given period, even when they've made the exact same mistake many times before. What's striking is that this bias doesn't seem to improve much with experience. People who have repeatedly underestimated timelines in the past will, with almost total confidence, underestimate the next one too. There's something about imagining the future that resists the lessons of the past, as though each new mental simulation gets a fresh, unearned optimism, disconnected from actual history. This matters here because the same distortion that makes people underestimate how long a project will take also makes people overestimate how much time they have left, in general, to become who they want to become. The future, in the imagination, is always roomier than the past turned out to be. There's a related concept worth naming, sometimes called temporal discounting, which describes a consistent pattern in how humans value time. Rewards and costs that are far away in time get mentally discounted, treated as less significant than they would be if they were happening right now. This explains a lot of ordinary behavior. Eating the dessert tonight feels more real than the health consequences decades from now. Scrolling for another 20 minutes feels more immediate than the goal that requires those 20 minutes and thousands more like them. But temporal discounting doesn't just affect small daily choices. It affects the entire shape of a life, because someday always sits comfortably in that discounted hazy distance, easy to deprioritize in favor of whatever feels more urgent today. The cruelty of this bias is that it never resolves on its own. There's no natural point where someday automatically becomes now. It only becomes now if something forces it to, and for a lot of people that forcing event, when it finally arrives too late to act on. There's a document worth mentioning here, not because it's unique, but because of how consistently its findings have been echoed elsewhere. Bronnie Ware, a palliative care nurse, spent years working with patients in the final weeks of their lives and recorded the regrets she heard most often. The most common one by a wide margin was some version of this: "I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me." Not far behind it was a wish to have worked less and a wish to have stayed in closer touch with friendships that quietly faded from neglect rather than conflict. What's notable about this list is what's absent from it. Nobody in her account expressed regret about not having achieved more, in the narrow sense of status or wealth. The regrets were almost entirely about unlived authenticity and unspent time with people who mattered. This is worth sitting with plainly, because it suggests that the things people postpone under someday are rarely the impressive, ambitious things. They're usually the honest ones. The conversation, the apology, the pursuit that felt too impractical to prioritize, the relationship that deserved more attention than it got. Here's a thought experiment worth trying, one that Stoic philosophers used deliberately, long before modern psychology gave it new names. Seneca, writing nearly 2,000 years ago, observed that people are remarkably careful with their money, but remarkably careless with their time, as though time were the one resource that could always be replenished. He pointed out that nobody hands their money to just anyone who asks, but almost everyone hands over their time freely, to distractions, to obligations they never examined, to relationships that quietly drain them without ever calculating the actual cost. The exercise Seneca suggested, in essence, was this. Imagine you can see the exact number of days remaining in your life, the way you can see the exact balance in a bank account. Would you spend today the way you're about to spend it? Most people, sitting with that question honestly, feel a small, immediate discomfort, because most days are spent as though the account were unlimited, when it demonstrably, mathematically, is not. There's a specific version of this illusion worth naming because it's grown more common as life expectancy has increased. The assumption that there's a large, comfortable amount of time available for starting later. This assumption isn't entirely irrational. Life expectancy genuinely has grown, but it quietly ignores something important, which is that most meaningful pursuits don't just require time at the end of a life. They require energy, risk tolerance, and flexibility that tend to be more available earlier than people assume, and that don't simply wait patiently for someday to arrive. Here's something worth separating clearly, because this anchor could easily be mistaken for an argument in favor of reckless urgency. Act on everything immediately, plan for nothing, live as if tomorrow doesn't exist. That's not quite it either, and swinging that far in the other direction creates its own problems. Impulsive decisions made from panic rather than clarity. The point isn't to eliminate patience or planning. The point is to notice when later has quietly become a permanent address rather than an actual destination, a place decisions go to be filed away rather than genuinely revisited. Borrowed loosely from productivity researcher Cal Newport and others who study long-term focus, involves periodically asking a specific, uncomfortable question about anything you've postponed. If not now, when, specifically? Not a vague eventually, an actual date, an actual condition that would need to be met. Most postponed pursuits, when pressed for this kind of specificity, reveal that there was never really a plan for later at all. Later was simply a more comfortable word for not yet decided, which is often, quietly, a more honest way of saying, probably never. There's something worth saying plainly here, without melodrama, because melodrama tends to get dismissed rather than absorbed. Time is the one resource on this entire list that cannot be recovered through effort, apology, or a change of mindset. Every other anchor we've discussed, fear, comfort, comparison, perfectionism, ego, can, in principle, be loosened at any point, no matter how long they've held on. Time is different. Every day spent anchored is a day that doesn't come back around for a second attempt. This isn't meant to produce anxiety. Anxiety, if anything, tends to freeze people further, adding yet another anchor to the pile. It's meant to produce something closer to clarity. An honest, undramatic recognition that the account, however large it might currently be, is not infinite, and that most of what's been filed under someday was never actually waiting for a better moment. It was waiting for a decision that only you could make. We've spent this entire journey going anchor by anchor, looking closely at what's been sitting quietly beneath the surface, disguised as caution, as peace, as realism, as care. It's time now to bring all of it back up to the light and take an honest look at what it actually takes to finally lift it. Go back for a moment to that ship we started with, sitting still in open water, sails up, wind exactly where it needs to be, and an anchor somewhere beneath the surface, quietly doing its job. We've spent this entire journey looking at what that anchor actually is. Not one thing, 11 of them, chained together, most invisible from where you're standing, each one convincing in its own way. Fear dressed up as caution, comfort dressed up as peace, other people's opinions given a vote they never earned, an old identity never updated to match who you've actually become, regret replaying the scene that already ended, a hunger for quick relief, quietly replacing the hunger for something real, comparison measuring your whole life against someone else's highlight, perfectionism using quality as a disguise for fear of being seen, a relationship that costs more than it gives, made bearable only by familiarity, a stretch of days with no direction, mistaken for a functioning life simply because it's full. Ego, protecting a version of you that was never quite true. And underneath all of it, the quiet lie that there's always more time. Here's something worth naming plainly, now that all 11 are sitting in front of us at once. None of them are separate from each other. Not really. They share a root, and the root is the same in every case. Each one exists to protect you from something uncomfortable in the short term, at the cost of something meaningful in the long term. Fear protects you from risk. Comfort protects you from struggle. Ego protects you from being wrong. Every single anchor on this list is doing exactly the job it was built to do. It's just that the job stopped serving you a long time ago, and it never got the memo. This is worth sitting with, because it changes the entire approach to lifting any of them. You cannot destroy an anchor by hating it. You cannot shame it loose. Shame, if anything, tends to feed it, because shame is just another form of the same threat these anchors were built to protect you from in the first place. What actually works is quieter than that, and less dramatic than the version usually sold in motivational content. It starts with simply seeing the anchor clearly, naming what it actually is, rather than the disguise it's been wearing. There's a pattern worth noticing across every single section we've covered. In each case, the anchor felt from the inside like something other than what it was. Fear felt like realism, comfort felt like stability, perfectionism felt like care. This is the actual mechanism holding all of this in place, not strength. Disguise, and disguises once correctly identified lose most of their power almost immediately, not because the feeling disappears, but because you stop mistaking the feeling for the truth. Here's something worth being honest about, because false promises don't help anyone, and this project was never interested in making one. Naming an anchor doesn't make it vanish. You don't watch a documentary and wake up tomorrow fearless, purposeful, and free of every limiting belief you've carried since childhood. That's not how any of this actually works. And anyone promising that version of change is selling something, not teaching something. What actually happens for the people who genuinely shift is slower and less cinematic. It looks like one email finally sent after being drafted 11 times. One honest conversation, uncomfortable, imperfect, but real. One day treated like it might actually be limited, followed by a small decision made accordingly. One argument where you said quietly, "You might be right," and meant it. None of these moments look like transformation while they're happening. They just look like small, slightly uncomfortable choices. It's only in hindsight, months or years later, looking back at a life that moved instead of one that stayed still, that the pattern becomes visible. There's a reason this documentary went anchor by anchor instead of offering one single solution at the very end. A single solution would have been a lie. These forces don't share one weakness. What loosens fear is not what loosens comparison. What loosens ego is not what loosens the illusion of unlimited time. The only thing they share is the requirement that you actually look at them, specifically, honestly, rather than treating "I need to change" as a vague feeling to sit with until it passes. Here's a question worth carrying forward, past the end of this, into whatever today or tomorrow actually holds. Of everything covered here, which anchor did you recognize first? Not which one sounded interesting, which one somewhere in the middle of listening made something in your chest tighten slightly. The specific discomfort of being seen a little too accurately. That discomfort is not something to move past quickly. It's the most useful thing this entire journey could have given you. Because that's the anchor doing the one thing it's never supposed to do, showing itself. Go back to that ship one more time. It was never broken. The wind was never the problem. The direction was always there, waiting. The only thing standing between that ship and open water was something small enough to be pulled up, one length of chain at a time, by hands that were capable of doing it the entire time. The water's still there. The wind hasn't gone anywhere. The only real question left is